So they say you shouldn't mix dinner with politics, but unfortunately, that's what I'm going to do. So what I'm going to share with you now is some work from a book that I've been developing for a very long time, since graduate school. And it looks at collaborations between Palestinian and Jewish writers, intellectuals, and cultural producers. And before I start, I just want to acknowledge that many of my mentors and people that helped me through are sitting here in this room, and I could not have done this work without them. They were really groundbreaking. So I want to say thank you to Orit Bashkin, Lita Levy, Nancy Berg, and of course Ella Shohat for the work that they did that made this work possible. So thank you. So what I'm going to try to do here in the short amount of time that I have, unfortunately I have reams of material that won't fit into 20 minutes, is talk a little bit about the Arab Marxist roots of early Mizrahi literature, and especially the literature of the transit camps, which in Arabic was Qisas al-Ma'abir, and Hebrew, of course, Sifrut al-Ma'bara, which developed during the 1950s within a partnership between Iraqi Jewish intellectuals and writers such as Sami Michael, Shimon Balas, Sasson Somech, and David Semach, many of whom had been active in the Communist Party in Iraq, and Palestinian intellectuals and writers such as Emil Habibi, Emil Tuma, Hana Abu Hana, Hana Ibrahim, Tawfiq Zayad, and Mahmoud Darwish, who were together functioning under the auspices of the Israeli Communist Party, which fostered a ground for this literary scene that they created. Together they drew on their common experience as socialist Arab intellectuals to fight against the colonial suppression of Arabic-speaking communities and cultures in Israel. Under the auspices of the party, they developed this journal called El Jadid, the New or Innovative, and also published in Al-Ittihad, the Union, which was the with the ICP's political Arabic newspaper. And they published original and translated works of literature, culture, and politics, essays, debates, poetry, and short stories. The transit camp literature, the short stories, which appeared in these publications in the 50s in Arabic and in the 1960s and 70s as Hebrew novels, provided literary accounts of the material and existential deprivation of Arab Jews in the ramshackle immigration camps where many began their lives in Israel. Within the context of this collaboration and its shared political and aesthetic values, this genre of work developed in accordance with the themes of collective responsibility, class consciousness, resistance to Euro-Ashkenazi racism, and colonial attitudes against the Arab, and the importance of preserving Arabic language and culture. Now, studies of the transit camp genre, which is identified in a lot of ways as the bedrock of Mizrahi literature, rely almost solely on the transit camp literature published in Hebrew. And this criticism discusses them as phenomena that largely emerges from the Israeli national cultural sphere. While many scholars, such as the ones I just mentioned, in addition to Batya Shimoni and Hanan Hevel, have been critical in establishing Mizrahi literature as an important counter-narrative that contests the Zionist status quo and broadens the social and political parameters of the Israeli national narrative, the criticism of Mizrahi writing in Israel still remains focused on Hebrew Mizrahi literature in a dialectical relationship with Zionism and on this literature's relation to the Israeli national narrative. In 1968, the eminent Palestinian intellectual and writer Ghassan Kanafani published Literature of Resistance in Occupied Palestine, which examined the impressive formation of an oppositional literary milieu amongst Palestinians inside Israel, and introduced the Arab world to its anti-colonial aesthetics and to the writers it nurtured, including Mahmoud Darwish and Samih al-Qasim, Tawfiq Zayad. Kanafani also outlined the daunting barriers Palestinian writers confronted in this period, including the murder and exile of a generation of cultural critics and writers, the destruction of institutions, gathering places, and ultimately entire cities as Arab intellectual hubs, the embargo between Israel and the Arab world, preventing access to Arabic literature, and Israeli military censorship and limitation on movements, gatherings, and publishing. What he omitted from the discussion, of course, was the fact that this scene that the writing emerged from and that worked to overcome these barriers also, especially in its earlier years, included Iraqis and Arab Jews, who had also witnessed the destruction of their literary and cultural worlds and would face the near extinction of Arabic as a native tongue among their own communities. So these common aims drove these intellectuals to work to attempt to revive an Arabic literary infrastructure from the ashes during the 50s. So what I want to talk about, and I'm going to just give you a little bit of the bullet points, is what are the main elements that come in to create a kind of bind between Palestinian and Arab Jewish writers and create a kind of fertile ground for collaboration and a joint style. Obviously, as I'll discuss, their common history and cultural background as writers, cultural producers, and as Arab Marxists. The cultural milieu of Marxist internationalism, decolonization, and Arab nationalism that infused the magazine's publications and created a cultural program in Arabic which included things like clubs, discussion groups, and also debates that took place in the newspaper and outside of the newspaper and magazine, poetry festivals that writers participated in, and in kind of journalism that was connected to storytelling and poetry. In addition, of course, there was a popular literary style that developed amongst these writers, and especially the writers of fiction developed a pretty distinctive fictional style that you can recognize, and that's very sort of common and in many ways didactic. And of course, it was a forum for the publication of stories and the discussion of stories and poetry. So the common background of these intellectuals. Beginning in 1947, the Palestinian Nakba, the Arab-Israeli War, and the establishment of the State of Israel brought about the near destruction of Palestinian society and culture, while setting in motion events that would also lead to the demise of the Jewish community in the Arab world. Although these two communities suffered from different modes of colonial exploitation under the Zionist establishment, they were both subject to anti-Arab racism, Orientalism, and cultural colonization, including the forced erasure of Arabic language, literature, and heritage. In the context of the formation of Al-Jadid and its milieu, Palestinian intellectuals bolstered Arab-Jewish understanding of the importance and possibility of an anti-colonial initiative that would resist the erasure of Arabic and the cleaving of Arab-Jewish identity. Many Iraqi Jewish writers and intellectuals had been part of the Communist Party in Iraq and also the burgeoning literary scenes, and they brought their expertise and also some of their literature, Arabic literature, into a scene that was really suffered from a destruction of literature due to the embargo and the war. Sami Mikhail's political background provides an example of the fruitful common ground that Palestinian and Iraqi Jewish communists shared as Arab Marxist intellectuals. He joined the Iraqi Communist Party in 1941, where he organized political cells among Shiite communities in Baghdad and in the surrounding countryside, taught literacy and politics in the underground schools, translated communist literature from English into Arabic, and worked on the editorial boards of communist newspapers. Mikhail's connection with the Palestinian intellectuals is expressed in a 1953 article he published in Israel on the occasion of Al-Ittihad's ninth anniversary. So this is when he was already in the country. Here he discusses how Ittihad was smuggled into Iraq, where it circulated through the communist underground, traveling with the youth through Baghdad's neighborhoods and streets, tree-shaded park benches, and busy cafes. Its contents illuminated by the glow of an electric lamp inside a comrade's house, or the light of a dying lantern struggling against the darkness in an unknown hut, end quote. As Mikhail tells it, communist newspapers were characterized as the beating hearts, al-qulub al-nabitha, a description that highlights their role in circulating ideas and tying together movements scattered across the region and the globe. Mikhail distinguishes Al-Ittihad as a heart that beat with particular force and regularity, while other communist newspapers were periodically forced to shut down. And it's true, it really ran from the 40s until the 90s. He reflects upon Al-Ittihad's role in the political education of young communists in Baghdad, recalling the inspiration they experienced when their teacher in the underground read to them from the newspaper. And he says, quote, "We used to rub our eyes and look at the real Baghdad, the barefoot Baghdad that suffered from trachoma and anemia, the forgotten Baghdad whose geography has not been mapped and whose history is not discussed, the Baghdad that sleeps on the bridge walkways when night comes, where swarms of flies fight over breadcrumbs. We did not have to don new glasses to discover this truth. We merely had to destroy the old, fake glasses, the glasses of tradition, fear, selfishness, and ignorance. Al-Ittihad, arriving from afar, helped us to destroy these glasses and rid ourselves of the short-sightedness that was imposed on us. Mikhail's assertion that his political vision in Baghdad was shaped by the perspective of the Palestinian newspaper he now edits closed a circle at the time linking his past and present as a communist in the Arab world. I spoke a little bit about, so that sort of gives you a general sense of some of the background. Now I'm going to talk a bit about a little bit about the cultural milieu, which the central part of was the kind of literary program that was set up by Al-Jadid and the surrounding writers that worked there. So the transit camp stories were written in the context of the core program, aimed at developing adab shabi, or a popular literature or literature of the people. At the magazine's inaugural conference in 1953, Emil Habibi's opening speech and the public conversation between conference participants honed the magazine's focus on a realist documentary literature based on the narratives of the struggles of local communities. The literature would narrate the traditions and habits of the people, their fears, wishes, and dreams that appear in their proverbs and expressions. It was to be grounded in a material understanding of the local population, their environs and dialects. Sami Michael encouraged writers to organize and otherwise spend time interacting directly with communities, the communities they wrote about in order to attain an intimate knowledge of the lives of the people. As a group of Arab Marxists, the Al-Jadid circle was hugely influenced by the socialist, realist, and Arab commitment aesthetics that flourished throughout the Arab world in the 50s and 60s. Despite their relative isolation from the Arab world, Al-Jadid was the only internal newspaper that was able to gain access to and republish articles from major progressive Arab newspapers such as Adab, At-Tariq, Jumhuriya, and Athakafa al-Wataniya. So that was quite important. Such magazines called on a connection, establishing a connection between history and literature, as expressed in a committed realism that called for the construction of counter-hegemonic narratives depicting anti-colonial struggles and the chronicles of a working class and peasantry on the margins of the national political imaginary. Within the larger scene of Arabic literature, al-adab al-multazim provided an umbrella term, so that's committed literature, al-adab al-multazim, which served to bring together leftist writers and cultural magazines influenced variously by socialist realism, pan-Arabism, and Jean-Paul Sartre's concept of existentialist engaged literature. What pulled these various circles together was the pressing political imperative of engaging literature with national liberation, socialism, egalitarian development, and decolonization in the Arab world by constructing progressive narratives that were accessible to the masses who were envisioned as an already constituted audience, and in turn constituting these same masses as a collective political subject. More specifically, this literature necessitated a renewed commitment to materiality, political consciousness, the reconceptualization of the role of the artist, who is seen as an agent of social change in society, and a view of the social body as the literary material, and thus the central subject of the literary work. Consequently, the writer emerges as a kind of social historian activist who both chronicled and shaped society. So this sort of writer, historian, community bard, activist role was highly influential in Al-Jadid's aesthetic vision and then in Mizrahi literature as well as Palestinian literature in various ways. The writer was both the responsible familiar offspring of Arab society and culture and an intellectual who had developed the critical distance necessary to recognize the workings of ideology and power driving economic, political, and colonial subjugation and reflect them in his or her writings. Al-Jadid drew on these tenets to support the conceptualization of literature as a form of history, news, and social documentary. This approach was also practical as it allowed writers to pursue social and historical documentation in their literary works. Likewise, the preservation of language, culture, and the historical record became a pressing necessity in light of the Zionist establishment's determination to exclude Arabic culture from state life. Connecting these different themes and needs was al-Jadid's aim to create an anti-Zionist collective narrative that would kind of radicalize and Arabize the identity or the communities of the new state. These aspects of its mission were specifically highlighted in a series of short stories titled Qissas Israelia, or Israeli Stories, including over 30 pieces published between 1953 and 1956. So, addressing a symposium on the realist short story, Jabra Nicola, he was an important Palestinian writer, activist, thinker, characterized Palestinian and Jewish intellectuals as Israeli realist and revolutionary writers. So in the context that we're in now, this obviously may seem to be somewhat assimilationist, but at that time, when we look at the content of the stories and at the project itself, this move can more plausibly be understood as entailing an attempt at de-Zionizing and democratizing the Israeli cultural space from within. These Israeli stories included tales like God Bless, about the struggles of an impoverished Yemenite fruit seller, Akhala Bil Amen, a security breach in which a young Palestinian man violates the military curfew to go to work on Christmas Day because he is desperate to procure his marriage dowry. Adil al-Kabir, which was by Sami Michael, in which a group of imprisoned Arab communists encounter a Palestinian peasant who is being threatened with torture and expulsion if he does not collaborate with the Israeli army. Shimon Balas's Tents, the chronicles of a young communist newspaper seller in the transit camp. Jamal Musa's Dima Waradad, which is about a Holocaust survivor who is beaten by an Israeli policeman at a demonstration against the Israeli-German reparations agreement, and eventually begins to imagine the policeman as an SS officer. And Michal's Imra'atain, Two Women, in which a woman being accused of infiltration seeks legal and organizational help from Jewish leftist supporters to advocate for her and her two young children to stay in the country. So essentially, this is the context in which the transit camp narratives were written within this kind of milieu of short story writing and telling. And the culture of Arab commitment was instrumental in mobilizing these writers to play a role in the social transformation of their communities through literature. Just want to see how much more time do I have? What? A few minutes. Okay. Oh, wait, sorry. Okay. I'll wrap it up. I'm just, actually, what I'll just do is, because I'm sort of running out of time here, I'm going to just read you some descriptions of the stories that they wrote, and then we'll kind of wrap it up, and I can give you more information in the Q&A. Both Michael and Balas' transit camp stories focused heavily on the deprivation perpetrated by a callous administration, the scourge of unemployment, and the breakdown of the family structure in the camps, themes which would take center stage in transit camp novels in Hebrew. In Michal's story, 1954 story, Hada Abi, This Is My Father, Shmuel is a young immigrant living in a tent with an aging parent, grappling with the unemployment afflicting the camps, which is characterized by a power struggle between the local Arab Jewish residents and the Ashkenazi agents of the Histadrut. As a representative of the older generation, on the other hand, Shmuel's father is defined by his strong attachment to tradition and religion. He does not speak or understand Hebrew well, something which exacerbates his fundamental sense of vulnerability and disorientation as a social outsider. Shmuel struggles to overcome poverty and find work, as well as to make sense of his position within the new society, while contending with the racist attitudes and policies of the Zionist establishment and the labor agency. The transit camp community is situated in El Majdal on absentee lands close to the Gaza border. Shmuel witnesses the fear constantly sown among the camp's residents by the Ashkenazi labor officials who control the desperately scarce jobs. Isolated and poor, the people, not least the protagonist's aging father, are gripped by the terror of the Arab infiltrators, whom they are told might come into the territory and attack them at any moment. Yet, at the conclusion of the story, it is the narrator's father who is killed by an Israeli sniper. The nearsighted old man is mistaken for a Palestinian intruder as he crosses the borderland groves of absentee Palestinians on his way to the synagogue. While the son stands over his father's dead body, which is clad in a black jalabiya, the sniper waves the father's Jewish prayer book around, insisting that it is proof that he was in fact an Arab spy attempting to impersonate an Orthodox Jew. The image emblematizes the fallacy of Zionist assimilation, which here leads both concretely and symbolically to the murder of the Arab Jew in the borderlands between Israeli and Arab worlds. It likewise points to the linked fates of Arab Jews and Palestinians, vis-a-vis the colonial racism of Zionist society. Shimon Balas's character grapples with similar issues with a stronger emphasis on class. In He Loved Life, Ahab al-Haya, Yusuf Abed spends his time trudging from the camp to the city in search of the job that will allow him to fulfill his desperate wish to marry his sweetheart Salima. But his unemployment persists until one day the secretary of the Histadrut offers to give him a job on the condition that he perjure himself by ratting out one of the communist organizers in the factory. The ensuing argument, in which the Histadrut members pressure and cajole Yusuf to lie in exchange for a job that will allow him to marry, clearly serve as an indictment of the relations of dependence between the camp residents and the Histadrut, and the corruption and racism within the organization itself. So I'll wrap up there just to say that these stories were a kind of a central part of the collection that I was talking about, and many of these themes then end up finding their way into the Sifrut HaMa'abara, or transit camp literature in Hebrew, and reveal these kind of subterranean links back to Palestinian resistance literature, back to Arab literature, Arabic resistance literature, and decolonizing literature of that period. And we can talk about that more in the discussion if you like. Thank you.